By the middle of the Ice Age, the landscapes of Eurasia were carved into unforgiving domains of ice, tundra, and windswept plains. Food was scarce, shelter fleeting, and every valley or forest edge became a prize worth fighting for. It was in this crucible that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens clashed most directly, not merely as rival species, but as competitors for the same life-giving resources. Territory meant survival. For the Neanderthals, the caves and rocky shelters of Europe had been theirs for hundreds of thousands of years. They knew each hunting ground, each migratory path of bison and deer, and every seasonal cycle that dictated where life could take root. Their ancestral memory stretched deep into time, guiding them in rituals of hunting, gathering, and survival that had been passed from one generation to the next. In these familiar landscapes they thrived, strong and enduring. But into these same lands came a new people, Homo sapiens, driven by restless expansion, population growth, and the relentless search for sustenance. At first, contact may have been fleeting. A trail of footprints pressed into the snow, a distant column of smoke rising from a hidden campfire, the echo of strange voices carried by the wind. The Neanderthals might have wondered what kind of beings left these signs. Were they dangerous rivals or mere shadows passing through? But soon, these distant marks of another presence gave way to direct confrontation. Two intelligent predators, armed with tools, fire, and strategy, were bound to collide. Neanderthals were formidable defenders of their homes. Their bodies, thick-boned and powerful, made them dangerous opponents at close range. A group of Neanderthal hunters, armed with thrusting spears, could stand shoulder to shoulder and repel wolves, lions, or even bears. When defending their caves or ambushing prey, they used strength and unity to their advantage. Yet Homo sapiens brought something different into this ancient contest. Not just physical power, but speed, adaptability, and larger social groups bound by intricate communication. They carried lighter-throwing spears and atlatls, weapons that could kill from a distance, reducing the risks of close combat. They moved faster across wide terrains, spreading out in greater numbers, and returned again and again to the same hunting grounds until dominance shifted. The struggle for territory was relentless. Imagine a frozen valley where herds of reindeer passed every winter. For Neanderthals, such a place was lifeblood, a site where meat, hides, and bones ensured the survival of their families. But once Homo sapiens appeared, the same valley became a contested ground. One band of hunters might stake out the river's edge, another the forest pass. Tensions rose not from ideology or conquest, but from necessity. Whoever controlled the migration routes, the caves with natural protection, or the rivers rich with fish, could survive the season. Those who lost would starve. This was not a single battle, but a drawn-out war fought in shadows, in the silence of forests, on frozen plains, and in the dark interiors of caves. It was a war of attrition, of outlasting, outmaneuvering, and slowly pushing the other into narrower corners of survival. The Neanderthals, bound by smaller groups and shorter lifespans, found it harder to keep pace with the growing numbers of Homo sapiens, who not only hunted, but also traded across distances, building networks that extended their reach. Yet the confrontation was not purely violent. There were moments when the two groups observed one another, hesitated, and perhaps even exchanged goods or knowledge. Some Neanderthals may have learned new techniques from sapiens, just as sapiens may have borrowed survival methods from their cousins. But beneath these encounters lay a growing imbalance. Homo sapiens, through sheer numbers and wider networks, were already tilting the future toward themselves. Cultural difference sharpened the divide. Neanderthals carried traditions deeply rooted in their immediate surroundings. Their tools, while effective, evolved slowly, reflecting a stable way of life tied to the cycles of the land they knew. Homo sapiens, by contrast, brought experimentation. They crafted ornaments, carved symbols, and built rituals that stretched beyond survival. This flexibility was more than creativity. It was strategy. It allowed them to adapt when climates shifted, when animals migrated, when rivers froze, or when competition rose. As decades passed, Neanderthal families who once roamed freely across vast landscapes found themselves pushed into smaller territories. Caves that had sheltered generations became contested. Valleys once abundant in game became battlegrounds of persistence. Some Neanderthals resisted fiercely, standing ground against intruding hunters. Others withdrew, retreating deeper into mountain ranges and forests where isolation became both shield and trap. The struggle for territory was the struggle for existence. In every patch of land seized or lost, the fate of future generations was decided. Homo sapiens spread steadily, multiplying, exchanging ideas, and outnumbering their rivals. Neanderthals endured, strong and resourceful, but increasingly cornered. And in this long contest, the seeds of extinction were being sown. For in the great game of survival, it was not always the strongest who triumphed, but those who could change, adapt, and endure the shifting tides of nature and competition. As the Ice Age deepened, the balance tipped ever further, and the Neanderthals, guardians of Europe's ancient landscapes, found their claim to the land slipping away, piece by piece, valley by valley, until survival itself became a narrowing path. The contest for survival between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens was not measured in weeks or even decades. It unfolded over centuries, across countless migrations of animals, shifts in climate, and the rise and fall of territories. To understand the depth of this struggle, one must imagine life not in the comfort of permanence, but in the raw uncertainty of a world where every winter carried the threat of extinction. For the Neanderthals, territorial knowledge was their greatest weapon. They had lived in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years and knew intimately where game would graze, where flint could be mined, and which caves offered shelter against the winds. Their existence was tied to these places, woven into the rhythm of the landscape. But when Homo sapiens arrived, that rhythm was disrupted. These newcomers had not lived for generations in the same valleys. They were wanderers, pressing forward, bringing fresh eyes to the terrain, and with them came a relentless hunger for expansion. The difference in mobility shaped the conflict. Neanderthals, though skilled hunters, were less inclined to roam across vast distances. Their groups were smaller, often extended families numbering perhaps 20 to 30 individuals. They moved seasonally but tended to remain within familiar ranges. Homo sapiens, however, operated in larger groups and were accustomed to long treks. They formed bands that could split and rejoin, adjusting to the needs of survival. This flexibility allowed them to enter Neanderthal ranges, test boundaries, and eventually stay where resources proved reliable. Territory became a chessboard of survival. One season, Neanderthals might hold the advantage, securing the caves overlooking a reindeer pass. The next season, Homo sapiens might seize the same ground, arriving in larger numbers and driving the herds into carefully planned ambushes. Both sides were predators, but sapiens carried the advantage of long-range weapons. The ability to strike from a distance not only changed hunting, but also confrontation. A Neanderthal band defending its kill with thrusting spears faced the new reality of incoming projectiles hurled from safe distances. And yet, Neanderthals did not vanish easily. Their strength and resilience were extraordinary. In direct combat, one Neanderthal warrior might match or even overwhelm several Homo sapiens. Their bodies, adapted to cold, gave them endurance in harsh climates where others might falter. They were not passive victims of history, but active competitors who defended their families and territories with vigor. There must have been many standoffs, moments when the two groups stared one another down across a riverbank or a ridge, the air thick with tension, neither side yielding. In those silences, the fate of generations hung in the balance. But as centuries passed, the numbers told a harsher truth. Homo sapiens reproduced more rapidly. Their broader networks allowed resources to be shared between distant groups. A band struggling in one region might move or seek aid from kin elsewhere. Neanderthals, more isolated, could not match this resilience. The valleys where they once reigned began to echo with new voices, new laughter, new rituals. The contest for land was not only about survival, but about identity. Each species carried within them a world view. Neanderthals had a deep bond with the caves they decorated and the hunting grounds they defended. Homo sapiens brought imagination that reached beyond the immediate. They sang songs, painted symbols, and carved objects that bound their communities together through shared meaning. These cultural differences mattered, for they strengthened cooperation. In times of scarcity, Homo sapiens could unite in larger numbers, guided by stories and traditions that transcended the moment. This ability to see beyond the immediate hunt gave them a cohesion that Neanderthals lacked. Even so, the struggle was not uniform. In some regions, Neanderthals held out for generations, maintaining dominance in familiar strongholds. In others, they may have lived side by side with Homo sapiens, exchanging knowledge or even intermarrying. The archaeological record reveals tools that seem to blend styles, suggesting that in certain times and places the line between species blurred. But coexistence was fragile, overshadowed by the steady expansion of sapiens. Imagine the weight of such centuries. A Neanderthal child born into a cave, once bustling with kin, might grow up to find the surrounding valleys increasingly empty. Herds grew thinner, winters harsher, and strange humans pressed closer each year. For the parents, every season was a calculation: stay and fight for the land of their ancestors, or retreat into more remote refuges. Retreat, however, often meant isolation, and isolation brought vulnerability. The territorial struggle was a slow erosion, not a sudden storm. Each loss was a small cut, one hunting ground abandoned, one cave taken, one herd driven away. Together, these cuts weakened the Neanderthal presence. Homo sapiens, meanwhile, filled the gaps, their population swelling, their networks expanding. The balance of survival shifted steadily, almost imperceptibly, until the outcome was undeniable. Yet, within this grim contest lay moments of shared humanity. When resources allowed, Neanderthals and sapiens may have traded, taught one another skills, or even cared for members of the opposite group. But survival leaves little room for sentiment. The encroachment of Homo sapiens was relentless, fueled by the same hunger for life that had once driven Neanderthals themselves. The land was finite, the food limited, and only one path forward could remain open. By the end of this long chapter in prehistory, Neanderthals found themselves cornered, both literally and figuratively. Their numbers dwindled, their ranges contracted, and their once wide presence across Europe shrank into scattered enclaves. The territories that had defined them for hundreds of thousands of years were no longer solely theirs. In their place, Homo sapiens had risen, marking the dawn of a new dominance that would eventually stretch across the world. As the struggle for territory intensified, the patterns of life for both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens grew increasingly defined by the pursuit of game. The great herds of mammoth, reindeer, bison, and wild horse were the lifeblood of survival. To secure these animals meant meat for the winter, hides for clothing, and bones for tools. To lose access to them meant hunger, sickness, and death. Thus, hunting grounds became the true battlegrounds where the future of the two species was determined. Neanderthals were formidable hunters. Their bodies were perfectly adapted to the grueling work of close-quarters confrontation with enormous beasts. They wielded sturdy spears designed for thrusting at short distances, weapons that required immense courage and coordination to use effectively. A band of Neanderthals could work together to bring down animals far larger than themselves, driving them into traps or cornering them against cliffs. Their knowledge of the land gave them an instinctive advantage. They understood where the herds would move, where the rivers froze just enough to allow passage, and which valleys offered ambush points. But Homo sapiens brought something new to the chase: innovation and range. Their spears were lighter, often designed for throwing, and when paired with spear throwers could strike prey from far away. This reduced risk, allowing hunters to bring down dangerous animals with less chance of injury. Injuries were no small matter in the Ice Age. For Neanderthals, a broken bone or deep wound could mean the difference between survival and death, not just for the individual, but for the entire group that relied on every member's strength. Homo sapiens, by lowering the risks of hunting, increased their margin for survival. Numbers also mattered. Neanderthal groups were small, bound tightly in family units. Homo sapiens, while also traveling in bands, often formed larger coalitions. When game was plentiful, they could cooperate in hunts involving dozens of individuals. Their communication skills allowed for intricate planning, driving herds into natural enclosures, coordinating attacks, and ensuring that meat was shared across the community. These strategies meant they could return again and again to the same hunting grounds, confident in their ability to outcompete their rivals. Territorial clashes were not always violent, but they were constant. A valley might sustain only one group at a time. If Neanderthals hunted there one winter, Homo sapiens might appear the next, forcing them out. Sometimes both groups might attempt to use the same territory, but the scarcity of animals ensured that one would eventually yield. These struggles left marks not easily seen in fossils or artifacts, but they are written in the patterns of disappearance. Neanderthals slowly faded from regions where sapiens arrived, their presence shrinking like a shadow retreating before the sun. Yet Neanderthals were not without resilience. In some areas, they held their ground for generations, adapting to the pressure. Evidence suggests that they, too, experimented with lighter tools or incorporated new hunting techniques. Perhaps they observed Homo sapiens and borrowed what they could. This shows that they were not passive nor incapable of change, but rather engaged in the same struggle to innovate under immense pressure. Still, their rate of adaptation was slower, bound by tradition and smaller social structures. What Homo sapiens could spread quickly across networks, Neanderthals learned in isolation. The importance of cooperation cannot be overstated. For Homo sapiens, survival extended beyond the hunt. Sharing food across larger groups meant that if one band struggled, another could provide. This collective safety net made them far less vulnerable to fluctuations in game supply. Neanderthals, more isolated, lacked this advantage. A poor hunt could devastate an entire family. The difference between small and large social networks was not just cultural, it was life or death. The seasonal migrations of animals further sharpened the contest. Each year, vast herds moved along ancient paths, crossing rivers, valleys, and plains. These migrations were predictable, but only one group could dominate the best ambush sites. Neanderthals who once had uncontested access to these routes found themselves facing competitors who multiplied rapidly. Over time, sapiens became the consistent holders of the richest grounds, while Neanderthals were forced into marginal territories where game was scarcer. It is tempting to imagine dramatic battles, bands of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens clashing directly for dominance of a valley. While conflict surely happened, it was the quiet erosion of access to food that mattered most. Each season of lost hunting ground was another nail in the coffin of Neanderthal survival. Starvation weakened them, reducing their numbers further, while Homo sapiens grew stronger, their children more likely to survive, their elders living longer to pass on knowledge. The struggle over hunting grounds also had cultural consequences. For Neanderthals, the loss of familiar valleys meant more than just food. It meant the loss of identity. Their knowledge of the land was their heritage. To be cut off from ancestral hunting sites was to lose the foundation of their existence. For Homo sapiens, by contrast, movement into new lands was part of their strength. They carried their identity with them, through symbols, rituals, and oral traditions, rather than tying it solely to one place. This difference made sapiens more adaptable as they expanded into new regions. Over the centuries, as sapiens spread, Neanderthal groups grew increasingly fragmented. Some withdrew into mountain strongholds, holding out in regions that were harder for larger populations to exploit. Others may have merged with the newcomers, their bloodline continuing in subtle ways. But as independent peoples, their hold on Europe's hunting grounds diminished, shrinking until their once vast presence became scattered enclaves. This slow conquest of territory was not one of deliberate genocide, but of relentless competition. Every successful sapiens hunt meant fewer animals for Neanderthals. Every sapiens child who survived the winter meant one more voice in the growing tide. The balance shifted not through sudden catastrophe, but through a steady, grinding contest in which even small advantages compounded over generations. The story of these hunting grounds is in many ways the story of why one species endured and the other disappeared. It was not the superiority of one hunt or one tool, but the accumulation of countless seasons, countless migrations, countless quiet displacements. By the time the contest reached its final chapters, the outcome was already written in the land. The herds moved still across the frozen plains, but fewer Neanderthal eyes remained to watch them. As the Ice Age tightened its grip across Eurasia, the world of both Neanderthal and Homo sapiens was becoming ever more unforgiving. Vast glaciers pushed southward, swallowing valleys that had once teemed with game. What had been dense forests turned into open, frozen tundra. The survival of any species here demanded not only strength, but adaptability. And it was in this crucible of hardship that the stark differences between the two species became more evident. Neanderthals, for all their power, were creatures of familiarity. Their lives had been forged in the rhythms of the European landscapes for hundreds of thousands of years. They had mastered ambush hunting in wooded valleys, using close-range tactics that relied on brute force and intimate knowledge of the terrain. But now, those forests were thinning, replaced by sweeping plains where mammoths and reindeer moved in enormous herds across vast distances. To chase, track, and intercept them required new tactics. For Homo sapiens, the change was less catastrophic. Their societies had long been more fluid, more experimental. They adjusted to the open plains by crafting lighter spears, atlatls, and eventually bows, weapons designed for striking prey from a distance. This innovation meant less risk during hunts and a higher chance of survival when dealing with dangerous megafauna. More importantly, humans began to employ cooperative strategies on a scale Neanderthals rarely attempted. Entire groups of men, women, and even adolescents worked together to funnel herds into natural traps or off cliffs, securing food for weeks at a time. But this was not just about hunting. It was about survival on a broader scale. The increasingly erratic climate required mobility. Neanderthals, stocky and powerfully built, struggled with long-distance travel across the ice and tundra. They had the strength for short bursts of endurance but were not as well suited for sustained migration. Humans, by contrast, were leaner, with more efficient body designs for covering great distances. They carried not just their families, but also fire, tools, and ideas across hundreds of miles, stitching together scattered tribes into an expansive network of kinship and exchange. This mobility carried cultural benefits, too. Humans, more than Neanderthals, developed systems of symbolic communication. Carvings on bone and ivory, beads crafted from shells, ochre pigments smeared on cave walls. All of these were more than decoration. They were a language of identity, memory, and myth. Such symbols allowed humans to carry knowledge across generations in ways that words alone could not. They created shared stories, binding far-flung groups together with common beliefs and rituals. Neanderthals did show sparks of similar creativity. In certain caves, archaeologists have found evidence of pigments and ornaments, proof that Neanderthals too could engage in symbolic thought. Yet these examples remain rare, isolated, almost hesitant. For them, symbolic expression never became the foundation of society as it did for Homo sapiens. Their world remained practical, immediate, focused on the hunt and the shelter of the moment. And yet, for all their differences, the two species were meeting more frequently. With the expansion of Homo sapiens into Europe, their ranges overlapped in ways that had never happened before. Rivers, valleys, and cave systems became contested spaces. Sometimes the interactions were violent, competition for resources sparking bloodshed, but at other times the encounters were more complex, more intimate. Genetic evidence shows that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens interbred multiple times, leaving a legacy that persists in human DNA today. These encounters were not mere accidents of survival, but part of a tangled web of relationships, sometimes hostile, sometimes cooperative, occasionally familial. But cooperation had limits. As the centuries wore on, it was the adaptability of Homo sapiens that gave them the upper hand. They could survive on a wider variety of foods, from roots and berries to fish and small game. They forged new weapons, experimented with shelter design, and spread their knowledge through storytelling and teaching. Neanderthals, though strong and skilled, remained tethered to the old ways. In a world that was changing too fast, their strengths began to look like weaknesses. Still, the story of this period is not one of immediate extinction. Neanderthals persisted for thousands of years alongside humans. They endured ice, fire, and competition with astonishing resilience. But with each passing generation, their populations thinned. Isolated groups disappeared from one valley after another. And while Homo sapiens multiplied, weaving a cultural fabric that stretched across continents, Neanderthals became increasingly fragile threads at the edges of that fabric. This slow fade was not the end yet. In the next movements of this story, the interactions between the two species would intensify. Conflict, coexistence, and exchange would all play their parts. But by this point in the saga, the outcome was becoming clearer. Evolution was rewarding not the strongest or the fiercest, but the most adaptable. And that advantage lay firmly in the hands of Homo sapiens. The march of time did not pause for either Neanderthal or Homo sapiens. As centuries passed, the differences between the two species grew starker, not only in how they lived but in how they imagined the world around them. Survival was no longer just a matter of muscle and instinct. It was becoming a contest of imagination, foresight, and social complexity. Neanderthals were deeply skilled at what they did best: crafting sturdy stone tools, reading the landscape, and enduring the bitter cold of Europe. Their survival strategies had been honed across millennia, and they were unparalleled in close-quarters hunting of massive animals like bison and aurochs. But these strategies, while effective in stable environments, became brittle when climates shifted quickly. Homo sapiens thrived in that instability. Their communities grew larger and more interconnected, and this scale of cooperation reshaped every part of their survival. Food was not just hunted, it was shared, preserved, and diversified. Hunters brought back game, gatherers collected roots and herbs, and others began experimenting with new techniques, like drying meat or storing fat in containers made of bone and hide. These strategies ensured not only survival in harsh winters, but surplus, an idea foreign to Neanderthal society, which lived largely from hunt to hunt. The innovation of Homo sapiens extended to their tools. While Neanderthals produced heavy scrapers and thrusting spears, humans refined smaller, more versatile implements. Blades chipped from flint could be reshaped into knives, arrowheads, or even needles for sewing hides into fitted clothing. This single leap, the ability to make tailored clothing, gave Homo sapiens immense resilience in cold climates. Neanderthals, wrapped in rough hides, were strong enough to endure, but humans could adapt their garments to shifting conditions. Clothing carried meaning beyond warmth. Sewn garments were sometimes decorated with beads, shells, and ochre dyes, merging utility with symbolism. Every thread of this innovation carried social weight. Clothing that displayed identity, rank, or even a story of belonging. Neanderthals, by comparison, rarely engaged in this form of symbolic self-expression. Their practical use of hides and tools left little space for adornment. Humans, however, were weaving culture into the very fabric of their survival. Another defining difference was in shelter. Neanderthals often relied on caves, which offered natural protection but also confined them to specific locations. Humans, by contrast, built shelters wherever they went, using mammoth bones, wooden posts, and animal hides stretched into durable tents. This meant freedom. They could migrate with the seasons, follow herds across great distances, and return to familiar camps year after year. Their world became a network of places linked by memory and story rather than fixed points of survival. And those stories mattered. Around firelight, Homo sapiens began to do something Neanderthals rarely attempted: telling myths, passing knowledge through narrative. Fire was more than warmth. It became the stage for imagination. Parents taught children not just how to knap flint or track animals, but why the stars shone, or how ancestors watched from beyond. These stories carried survival knowledge coded into myth, ensuring that even a child absorbed generations of wisdom before stepping out into the hunt. Neanderthals, too, must have shared knowledge verbally, but their social structures were smaller, tighter, less expansive. With fewer individuals in each group and fewer links between them, knowledge spread more slowly and less widely. For Homo sapiens, networks of exchange stretched over hundreds of miles. A shell bracelet found in an inland settlement might have come from the coast, carried through hands of traders bound by kinship and ritual. Such networks meant more than trade. They meant resilience. If one valley failed, another could provide. Neanderthals rarely had this safety net. The consequences of these differences rippled across the generations. Human groups grew larger, and larger groups meant more complex roles. Some individuals specialized as hunters, others as tool makers, others as healers or storytellers. This division of labor freed innovation to flourish, pushing humans into a cultural momentum Neanderthals could not match. Still, Neanderthals were not vanishing shadows in this story. They endured with astonishing persistence, holding on to territories in rugged landscapes that humans found harder to dominate. They were strong, resourceful, and deeply attuned to the rhythms of their homelands. Yet, even in these strongholds, the pressure was mounting. Climate change, dwindling resources, and the steady encroachment of Homo sapiens pressed in from all sides. The outcome was becoming clearer with every passing century. While Neanderthals were bound by the weight of tradition, Homo sapiens were carried forward by the currents of innovation. Survival in this new Ice Age world was no longer just about strength. It was about the ability to imagine, to adapt, to transform. And in that arena, the balance of power was tipping. The Ice Age was a merciless teacher, and both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were its students. Yet, as the millennia passed, it became ever clearer that the two species were learning very different lessons. Neanderthals clung tightly to their traditions, surviving as they always had. Homo sapiens, on the other hand, transformed survival into innovation, adapting not just to endure, but to expand. One of the most striking differences was how each species approached food. Neanderthals were masters of big game hunting. They had perfected the art of bringing down colossal beasts like mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses. Their muscles, bones, and tactics were designed for power and close combat. But when climates shifted and herds grew scarcer, this dependence became a trap. Hunting giant animals required immense energy and came with the risk of devastating failure. One lost hunt could mean hunger for the entire band. Homo sapiens broadened their menu. They hunted, yes, but they also gathered wild fruits, nuts, roots, and fish. They experimented with traps for small game, nets for fish, and even storage pits to preserve food longer. Their survival was not tied to the fate of one hunt, but spread across a variety of sources. This diversification gave them an edge. When one food source failed, another could take its place. It was adaptability written into their very diets. This same flexibility appeared in technology. Humans invented composite tools, wooden shafts with stone blades bound by resin and sinew, far more efficient than the single-use tools of Neanderthals. They crafted bows and arrows, extending their reach from close-range ambushes to long-distance precision. Such inventions transformed the hunt, reducing risk and increasing success rates. Neanderthals, with their thrusting spears, fought prey up close, a method that demanded bravery but exposed them to mortal danger again and again. The difference was not only physical but cultural. Humans infused their lives with meaning beyond survival. They painted on cave walls, carved figurines from bone and ivory, and adorned themselves with beads and pigments. These were not mere decorations. They were symbols of identity, ways of binding communities together through shared belief and story. Art gave shape to memory and imagination, carrying culture across generations. Neanderthals, though they occasionally used pigments and crafted ornaments, did not embrace this symbolic world with the same intensity. For them, survival was practical. For Homo sapiens, survival was also spiritual. This cultural layer provided resilience. Shared symbols created larger communities, uniting people beyond immediate kin. A bead of the same style worn hundreds of miles apart told of connections stretching across vast landscapes. These networks allowed information, goods, and even allies to flow between groups. In times of scarcity, such connections meant the difference between collapse and endurance. Neanderthals, with their smaller, isolated groups, lacked this web of support. The story of fire highlights this divergence as well. Both species used it for warmth and cooking, but Homo sapiens made fire into the heart of community life. Around it, songs were sung, myths were told, knowledge was passed down. The fire became a cultural hearth, anchoring memory and identity. Neanderthals no doubt spoke and shared wisdom too, but the archaeological record shows little evidence of the same symbolic richness that defined human firelight gatherings. The result was not immediate domination, but a gradual widening of the gap. Neanderthals remained formidable, but their strategies were optimized for a world that was slipping away. Their strength, honed for a particular ecology, became less relevant as climates swung and humans pressed in. Homo sapiens, armed with flexibility, imagination, and collaboration, could pivot and thrive where Neanderthals struggled. By this stage in prehistory, the balance of power was no longer evenly matched. Neanderthals held on to their strongholds, but their grip was weakening. Homo sapiens were multiplying, expanding, and embedding themselves into landscapes through culture, technology, and social networks. The contest of survival was shifting inexorably in one direction. Yet, even as Neanderthals stood on the edge of decline, they remained part of the story of humanity. Their persistence, skill, and strength shaped the path of Homo sapiens, and their eventual fate would leave echoes not just in legend, but in our very genes. The next stage of this saga would bring the two species into even sharper contact, and in those encounters, the destiny of both would be sealed.